My name is Jim Rain. I'm 20 years old and have almost no work experience, but very recently I was hired as a ranger at a small mountain park called Springwood State Park. This park is located somewhere in the remote corners of Colorado at the foot of a majestic mountain range. As a child, I often dreamed of landscapes like these: tall pines, turquoise lakes, and jagged peaks on the horizon. I always believed that people found serenity in places like these. However, in my very first week on the job, I realized that solitude can be deceiving. Instead of peace, I began to feel a strange tension, as if nature itself was hiding secrets in the endless darkness among the firs and abandoned trails. My primary duty is to keep watch in the radio room and monitor any emergency situations. During the day, visitors wander into the park, random tourists show up, and sometimes other rangers drop by to discuss plans for the evening or hand over the latest reports on fire hazards. But by dusk, most of the staff has left, and the few travelers quickly return to their campgrounds. When the sky fills with a crimson glow and the mountain tops are shrouded in twilight, everything falls silent. It is at these hours that my shift begins. I remember that evening especially well. As we were leaving, my partner warned that the weather might turn bad, since the forecasters predicted a strange mix of warm and cold air currents. A downpour or fog didn't scare me, but the thought of being alone in the park among the gloomy silhouettes of trees was almost unbearably oppressive. Still, work is work. I closed the door behind the last ranger, checked to make sure the radio was charged, and settled at my desk with the park guide. My usual routine involved listening to messages, responding to the occasional call, and then doing a routine visual inspection of the perimeter from the radio room window and through the surveillance cameras installed at the park entrances. That day, no incidents were expected. The safety reports were clear, with no fires or major emergencies. I relished the moments of calm as I half listened to the soft crackling of radio frequencies. In my headphones, a voice would occasionally break through the static, likely the result of overlapping channels or a distorted signal from a tourist's walkie-talkie. At first, I paid it little heed. Such random noise on the air was commonplace. Against the backdrop of the quiet evening, only a solitary moon hung above the pine tops. Time seemed to stand still, and suddenly a chill ran through me. I decided to distract myself by sifting through old magazines and reports. Sometimes there were amusing stories about someone getting lost or stuck on one of the hard-to-navigate trails. Usually everything ended well. I had come to believe that nothing truly frightening could ever happen in the park. True tragedies were rare. The only thing that slightly unnerved me was the locals' chatter about an old myth circulating among the rangers. They said that, at night, they had once seen a strange creature emerging onto the trails deep in the forest. I considered it nothing more than a tale told to entertain newcomers. Sitting at the monitors, I kept glancing out the window. Through the glass, I could only see the silent mass of trees blurred by dusk. Occasionally, a flash appeared on the horizon, perhaps a distant lightning strike. I wasn't in the mood to sleep. The tension kept me alert, and a nagging thought suggested that the night might turn out to be longer and stranger than I expected. After a few minutes, I got up to turn on an extra desk lamp. The radio room was always dim, and reading reports by weak light strained my eyes. It was at that moment I fully felt the weight of isolation. With at least 8 hours left until dawn, the floor creaked underfoot, and my steps echoed dully off the walls. A cold draft brushed my face, as if it had sneaked into the room, even though all doors and windows were closed. Everything's going as usual, I thought, trying to reassure myself. I just have to hold on until morning. Yet a premonition hinted that there would be no peace tonight. An odd anxiety crept in, as if the very silence around me was charged with tension. I tried to dismiss these heavy thoughts and focused on checking the equipment, completely unaware of how swiftly my routine shift would transform into a nightmare. The next 30 minutes passed in my usual manner. I listened to the steady hum of the airwaves, with occasional bursts of static, but overall everything sounded calm. At one point, I caught a barely discernible crackling, as if someone was trying to get through but couldn't break past a wall of interference. I switched to the radio, manually adjusted the reception dial to filter out adjacent frequencies, yet all I heard were fragmented words merging with the static. I was about to dismiss it as a defect or interference from a nearby station when the signal suddenly cleared. A woman's voice, trembling and clearly terrified, came through. From her intonation, labored breathing, and halting phrases, it was evident that she was either running or hiding. Even without explicit words, I sensed the mounting panic on the other end of the line. The woman pleaded for help, insisting that someone was chasing her. She repeated that her pursuer was not human, though she couldn't describe it clearly because of her intense fear or the interference. I didn't catch a full conversation, but in my mind her desperate message was clear. A creature is approaching. It's neither animal nor human. This echoed in my head against the backdrop of eerie static. At that moment, my hands began to tremble. I realized I had to act. The woman, it seemed, was genuinely in danger. In such a state, people often make irrational choices, like running in the wrong direction and getting hopelessly lost. I readjusted the frequency, trying to pinpoint the exact location of the distressed caller. Fortunately, amid the fluctuating interference, she managed to mention a landmark, an old fire lookout tower on the northeast side of the park. I knew that place. Once it was staffed to watch for forest fires until a new tower was built, leaving the old one abandoned. Suddenly, a sharp noise burst through the air like a microphone clattering to the floor or a woman being thrown violently. Then came an ominous roar that sent shivers down my spine. It sounded inhuman, low, prolonged, and imbued with a primal malice. Seconds later, the radio went silent. The connection was lost, as if someone had cut the power on the other side. Inside, fear battled with common sense. As a newcomer, I didn't have much experience, but I knew I couldn't ignore such a call. I had to check what was happening, even if it turned out to be a cruel prank. Such antics had occurred before, but that staggering roar was no joke. I exhaled slowly, trying to steady the tremor in my knees. Then I opened the cabinet containing maps and began frantically searching for a detailed park plan, mentally reviewing the instructions for emergencies. The old fire lookout tower was about an hour's walk from the main radio station if one followed the trail through dense pines. The route was no easy path, especially in the dark. I realized that contacting the other rangers was impossible at that moment. The connection was down, and the nearest post was closed for the night. No one was on duty nearby. A sense of duty overcame my terror. Even if it turned out to be a false alarm, I had to check. I couldn't leave a potential victim to fend for themselves. An uncanny feeling told me that I was stepping into the unknown. But I had no choice. I closed the report folders, confirmed that the radio was still picking up some signals, and began to prepare. As soon as the memory of that mysterious sound on the speakers resurfaced, a chill ran through me. Perhaps I didn't yet realize that the eerie roar was merely the prelude to even more horrifying events, but retreat was no longer an option. When I finally decided to step out into the night, the fear within me intensified. All around, darkness reigned. The moon was intermittently hidden behind heavy clouds, leaving the forest in near total blackness. I carefully gathered my gear. Following protocol, I grabbed a 12-gauge shotgun with a few shells, even though I rarely had to use it. I also took a flare gun to signal for help or ward off a large animal. I had been given the flare gun on my first day along with instructions I then thought were excessive. I never imagined I'd actually need it in this park. But now those precautions didn't seem excessive at all. I packed a map of the park, a flashlight, spare batteries, a radio, a pocket knife, and 2 flasks of water into a small backpack. I even grabbed a first aid kit almost reflexively. All the while, my imagination conjured up frightening images of what might await me in that abandoned tower. Deep down, a voice whispered, "Don't do this. Stay in the radio room. Lock the door and wait until morning." But my conscience and the remnants of my courage urged the opposite. I felt that someone had to save that woman if she was indeed still alive. Leaving the radio room, I slowly closed the door behind me, trying not to dwell on the fact that I might be stepping into a night full of dangers. The trail leading to the northeast began near the tool shed and disappeared into the depths of the pine forest. My small flashlight illuminated only a narrow strip of ground at my feet, while the rest of the world was swallowed by thick shadows. Every sound became amplified as I strained to listen to every rustle. I usually enjoyed the nighttime sounds, the chirping of crickets, the calls of owls, and the occasional creak of branches. But tonight, it was as if the nocturnal orchestra had fallen silent. Step by step, I made my way along the path, trying to keep a confident pace. The road I knew by day now seemed endless and unfamiliar. Tree roots jutted out from the ground, threatening to trip me like invisible traps. The forest floor absorbed every sound, and even my own breathing sounded deafening. Occasionally, I'd stop and scan the darkness, half expecting to see the silhouette of my pursuer or catch a glimpse of a pair of eyes. Sometimes the sound of wind whistling through the treetops reached me, like the quiet murmur of 100 voices scrutinizing my every move. I tried to calm myself. It couldn't be that something supernatural was truly lurking here. Most likely, the woman had encountered a wolf or a bear, panicked, and exaggerated the threat. Yet, the feeling persisted that none of this was coincidental. The terrifying roar I had heard on the radio was simply too disturbing. Soon I noticed that the usual sounds of nature had completely ceased. There were no chirping crickets, no rustling of nocturnal birds, no signs of animals rustling in the bushes. It was as if someone had turned off the entire nighttime orchestra. Such dead silence was unnatural for a forest. Normally, even if a predator was nearby, the sounds would never vanish so completely. Suddenly, I felt an urge to turn back. It seemed as though the very air was permeated with an unseen, almost tangible threat. Yet, it would have been cowardly to retreat knowing that someone might be dying at the claws of an unknown creature. I quickened my pace, never letting go of my shotgun. A thought echoed in my mind. Only half the way left. Soon I'll see the tower. Occasionally I stopped to call out, hoping that if the woman heard my voice, she would give some sign, but there was no reply. The oppressive silence grew thicker, like a dark blanket draped over the trees and trail. I could feel the tension building inside me. Every muscle was tensed, ready for an unexpected attack. I couldn't shake the thought, what if this was a trap? But I couldn't give up. If there truly was someone out there, I had no right to sit idle. With that resolve, I picked up my pace, mentally rehearsing what I'd say if I encountered her. And though we weren't supposed to have conversations, I mentally prepared to issue curt commands. check for injuries, call for backup. But more than anything, I hoped that it was just a terrible misunderstanding and that the woman would be all right. Unfortunately, my intuition whispered that things were not that simple. I continued down the trail, unaware that the worst was yet to come. The abandoned fire lookout tower the woman had mentioned emerged from the dark silhouettes of the trees, like a grim figure from a bygone era. The moment I saw its top jutting above the pine crowns, my heart sank with a heavy premonition. I approached the dilapidated fence and began inspecting it with my flashlight. The boards were coated with peeling paint, and the metal parts were rusted. Here and there were marks resembling deep scratches, as if something had clawed at the surface. At the base of the structure, something strange happened. Suddenly, I felt an overwhelming nausea and dizziness, as if I were hit with a bout of seasickness. I staggered, nearly dropping my shotgun. After a few seconds, the sensation passed as if nothing had happened. This frightened me. Unexplained symptoms emerging out of nowhere in such a place evoked disquieting thoughts. I considered all sorts of anomalies, but decided to chalk it up to fatigue and nervous tension. Yet the feeling of being watched never left me. I swept the beam of my flashlight over the cluster of trees and bushes surrounding the tower. For a moment it seemed as if two bright dots flashed between the pine trunks, like reflections in the eyes of a nocturnal predator. But as soon as I focused, they vanished, like a mirage. That brief surge of adrenaline made it clear. I was not alone. Every instinct inside me screamed to leave, but the thought of a helpless woman, possibly trapped somewhere above, would not let me turn back. I tried not to peer too deep into the darkness and focused on the tower. My feet creaked on the rickety wooden steps that sagged as if they could collapse at any moment. The damned railings wobbled, sometimes missing entirely. My heart pounded so loudly I could hear it in my ears. A light rain began to fall, making the wood slippery. But it was too late to turn back. I had climbed high enough that a sudden gust of wind threatened to knock me off if I faltered. When I finally reached the door to a small room at the top, I paused to catch my breath. Inside, darkness reigned, and a faint draft exhaled a musty smell of decay and dust. I knocked on the wall with the butt of my shotgun, hoping that if anyone was inside, they'd respond. But all I received was empty silence, broken only by the wind howling below. Summoning my courage, I opened the door. The hinges creaked plaintively, and the air inside was stale and damp. My flashlight illuminated an old chair overturned on the floor. In one corner, a pile of debris, shards of wooden parts, and some ragged cloth covered in dust, lay forgotten. Yet there was no trace of blood or signs of a struggle. Everything looked as if it hadn't been touched in years. I stepped inside, scanning the room with my beam, fearful of finding a body, but there was nothing of the sort. My heart raced while a whirlwind of questions swirled in my mind. Where had that woman gone? She had mentioned this very place. Only then did I realize that the oppressive sensation of a foreign gaze had intensified. I cautiously peered out the window, its glass smeared with dirt. Down below, at the base of the tower, all was empty. Only the wind swayed the branches. Yet inside, I felt that something unnatural was at work. I knew I still had to examine every detail of this gloomy room. Perhaps there was a clue to what really happened and where to find the woman who had cried out for help. Little did I know that the clues I discovered here would only plunge me deeper into the nightmare that was just beginning to unfold in the dark recesses of Springwood State Park. The interior of the room was filled with the musty air and dust of decades past. My flashlight's beam struggled to penetrate the cobwebs, outlining the broken chairs, shards of glass, and a rickety table. I moved cautiously, shotgun at the ready, unable to shake the feeling that every dark corner might conceal a threat. The emptiness here pressed down more oppressively than any beast. It felt as if I had entered the realm of oblivion. In one corner, I discovered old newspapers and a radio, as though abandoned by ghosts of the past. I carefully brushed the dust off the first newspaper and saw the headline: "Mysterious Death in the Springwood Woods. Woman Killed by an Unknown Creature." The date on the front was 1985. The article described ragged wounds, uncharacteristic of ordinary predators, and mentioned rumors attributing the tragedy to the mysterious Dogman, a half-wolf, half-human creature said to roam these mountains. To me it sounded outrageous, yet that eerie roar on the radio made it impossible to dismiss such a theory. I flipped through the pages, coming across notes about rare tourists who swore they had heard terrifying screams deep within the park at night. Some even claimed that on certain radio frequencies, one could pick up echoes of the dying woman's cries. Skeptics blamed atmospheric interference, but these materials exuded a grim realism. Black and white photographs of people in old firefighter uniforms, vague shadows in the background. Perhaps this tower had once been the center of those ill-fated events. I picked up the radio, a heavy vintage device that looked almost like a museum piece. Deciding to test its condition, I carefully turned the power knob. Several indicators flickered weakly, and a soft static began to emerge from the speaker. For a moment I thought I heard a muffled moan, a woman's sound as if it were the same voice that had called for help over the radio. My heart clenched painfully, and then everything fell silent. The device died, as if it had expended its last spark of energy. Looking around, I found no trace of blood or signs of a struggle. Everything, from the furniture to the personal belongings, appeared as though it had lain undisturbed for years. If this tower had long been abandoned, how could the woman have reached it? And why had her desperate cry of being chased been transmitted over the radio? The answers lay hidden beyond these crumbling walls. Yet the thought that some monster might be prowling below made my hands tremble even more. Suddenly, a quiet roar pierced the silence from below. I moved to a broken window and peered outside. The darkness below was impenetrable, even to the moonlight. Dense pines formed a fortress around the tower. But between them, I caught a vague movement, as if something large and powerful was roaming about, scanning for me. Cold sweat broke out on my forehead. Deep in my mind, the image of an old news clipping about a half-human, half-beast emerged once more. In that moment, the legend assumed a terrifying reality. Staying in the dilapidated building was too risky. The boards were rotten, the railings unstable, and if attacked here, there would be nowhere to hide. Yet venturing outside meant facing a creature that, according to rumors, could tear me to shreds. I took a deep breath, trying to quell the panic. Cursing myself for getting involved in this nightmare, I realized that I had no choice. My duty was to determine whether there was any chance to save the unfortunate victim, even if she turned out to be nothing more than an echo from the past. In a drawer beneath a table, I found an old knife, rusted almost to its core, but I still slipped it into my pocket. I checked my shotgun, feeling the heft of the weapon in my hands. Perhaps it wouldn't stop the legendary monster, but it was better than doing nothing. Outside, the stormy wind hissed through a broken window, stirring up cobwebs and deepening the atmosphere of desolation. A thunderstorm was approaching. In the distance, lightning flashed, briefly illuminating the tower's silhouette like a sinister spire. After closing the newspapers, I scanned the room once more with my flashlight. There were no signs of recent activity. Mist gathered at the entrance, seeping through every crack. Fear coursed through my entire being, but I knew I had to press on, for reality had grown even more frightening than the legends. Taking a deep breath, I prepared to descend to where a quiet call of despair beckoned me. Whether the dogman was real or merely a large beast, I couldn't stay. And though every muscle in my body trembled, my mind steeled itself for an encounter with whatever lurked in the night. For only in this way could I learn the truth and perhaps save someone's life, or at the very least my own. The descent from the dilapidated tower turned into a torturous ordeal. Rain hammered the slippery steps while the muffled rumbles of thunder shattered the nighttime silence. I shivered not only from the cold, but also from the realization that somewhere nearby, a monster lurked. When my feet finally touched the ground, I spotted in the distance a silhouette, unnaturally tall and beast-like. Its eyes burned with a reddish glow, and the entire creature seemed like a mass of primordial fury. I aimed my shotgun. The monster lay in wait, hiding among the trees and only occasionally peeking out from the darkness. My heart pounded furiously while my mind insisted this was no ordinary beast. Then, an enraged roar cut through the downpour. The creature leaped forth, covering a couple of meters in a single bound. I fired, feeling the recoil. The buckshot struck the monster, and it roared but didn't fall. Its eyes flared with malice, and the next blow knocked me off my feet. I crashed into the mud, a sharp pain searing through my side. The creature's wet fur, enormous claws, and the madness in its yellow eyes made my blood run cold. Desperately trying to keep the beast's snapping jaws away from my throat, I fumbled for a knife and plunged it into its side. Dogman howled and convulsed, giving me a brief respite. I scrambled to my feet and fired another burst, this time in vain, as the shot careened into the trees. Blood trickled down my ribs, and a veil of agony blurred my vision. The monster continued to roar, though it now appeared wounded, for it did not charge again. I had one chance left: run. I bolted, ducking under low-hanging branches and pushing my way through the wet undergrowth. The raindrops turned into icy needles, whipping against my skin. The only thought that pulsed through my mind was, survive at any cost. It seemed as if the monster could appear from anywhere. Adrenaline drove me forward even as my legs slipped in the mud and a sharp pain tore through my side. The dark forest swallowed me whole. The wind was nearly silent. Only the relentless drumming of the rain and the rustling of branches could be heard. Yet every now and then, a sinister rustle sounded nearby, as if the creature was stalking me. Dogman, like a skilled hunter, was closing in, while I clutched my shotgun in the last vestiges of resolve. Stumbling, I searched desperately for the familiar trail that would lead me back to the radio room. A flash of lightning illuminated the pines for an instant, and I could still feel the monster's presence. Its roar echoed alternately from the left and the right, as though it were toying with me, waiting for me to tire. Pain and blood loss sapped my strength, yet I knew that stopping now would be tantamount to death. At last, a gap appeared between the tree trunks, where the main trail should be. Behind the trees, something glimmered, perhaps the light of a shed's lantern. I didn't have time to analyze the details. A surge of hope filled me, but in that very moment, a fierce roar erupted from the left. Dogman burst out of the darkness, clearly unwilling to lose its prey. I spun around and fired blindly. The muzzle flash revealed the monster's silhouette and its ferocious, snarling face, but I couldn't tell if I had hit my mark. Taking advantage of the creature's momentary confusion, I sprinted with every ounce of strength left in me. Waves of pain crashed over me as my vision darkened. Yet the thought of the radio room kept me moving. The heavy pounding of footsteps behind reminded me that the pursuit was close. I couldn't stop to tend to my wounds. There was no choice but to run until my legs gave out. Every step made me unsteady. My breathing became erratic, and it felt as if my lungs might burst from the strain. Every snapping branch and rustle of leaves under the monster's paws carried a threat. But a glimmer of salvation lay ahead, and I poured all my remaining energy into reaching it. Dogman was still somewhere close, yet I hoped that, even for a moment, it would lose my trail. All I could do was pray I'd reach the coveted door of the radio room before the creature finally decided to tear me to shreds. When a faint light from the radio room appeared in the distance, a final burst of desperate hope ignited within me. Limping and gasping for breath, I raced toward the shelter, feeling the unseen gaze of my pursuer sear my back. The downpour eased, but the thick mud squelched underfoot, leaving bloody tracks in its wake. I strained my ears to every sound, terrified of catching a sudden lunge from Dogman emerging out of the darkness. Somehow, I managed to reach the door. With great effort, I flung it open, slammed it shut, and locked it behind me. Outside, the ominous silence still reigned. Collapsing onto my knees inside, I dropped my shotgun and gasped for air. The adrenaline drained away in an instant, and a tidal wave of pain from my wounds overwhelmed me. Blood seeped through my clothes, pulsing in time with my heartbeat. I knew I wouldn't last long without tending to my injuries. Summoning what little strength I had left, I crawled over to the first aid kit. I opened it, retrieved bandages and antiseptic, and began to treat the deep lacerations on my side. The pain was searing, yet any delay could be fatal. Once I wrapped my wounds tightly, I slumped weakly against the wall and stared into the dim gloom. There wasn't a sound. No roar, nothing. I hoped the creature wouldn't dare breach the building, though that offered only scant comfort. Finally, I forced myself to check the radio station's control panel. The display still glowed, but only hissing static filled the airwaves. I feverishly scrolled through the channels, desperately trying to call for help. In response, there was nothing but a prolonged rumble. Likely the storm had damaged the antennas, making communication with the outside world futile. I refused to give up. I continued switching frequencies until the speaker emitted a brief burst. For a moment, it sounded as though that same terrified female voice was breaking through the distortion, but within seconds, the signal vanished. My heart sank. Perhaps that was the last trace of the unfortunate soul I had been trying to save. Or maybe just a phantom, an echo of an old tragedy lingering in the static. Exhaustion finally overtook me, and I closed my eyes for a moment, greedily inhaling the stale air of the radio room. But sleep meant vulnerability. Outside, the night still raged, and time crawled by agonizingly. My imagination conjured images of dogmen circling nearby, sniffing for my blood. All I could do was hope that dawn would bring even a modicum of relief. Gradually, the storm subsided. I caught a glimpse of gray light seeping through the pine treetops. Morning was breaking. The silence outside pressed against my nerves, and I couldn't tell if the monster had vanished or was still waiting. The throbbing pain in my wound reminded me that I had survived only by a miracle. There was no guarantee Dogman wouldn't reappear, day or night at any moment. Yet as dawn painted the forest in muted gray tones, I felt a relative sense of safety. Still, the residue of fear clung to my soul, and outside, indistinct shadows slid along the pines. I slumped into a chair, clenching my teeth against the pain, and then I heard a faint crackle from the radio speaker. as if a distant echo of that female voice was trying once more to break through the static. Fear and despair mingled with the bitter realization the evil had not disappeared and could not be vanquished by simple means. Perhaps I had escaped, but the soul of that woman and the creature itself would continue to haunt these woods, trapped in an endless cycle of terror. Thus I met the dawn, with a battered body and a shattered mind. Gazing out the window, I could only wonder, had the monster truly retreated? Or was it lying in wait in the dark corners of the forest? And if that dreadful call ever sounded over the radio again, would another brave soul be willing to tread the path that leads to Dogman and the endless loop of cursed voices? Story 2. My name is Eddie, and in August 1995, I found myself in Redwood National Park in California as part of a small scout troop. I was only 12, but I felt grown up enough not to fear these shadowy forests. The towering trees seemed like invincible giants from another world. I was captivated by their gnarled roots, the soft carpet of pine needles underfoot, and the mysterious shadows silently shifting along the trails. With me were Ryan, Nick, and Ben, kids my age. We weren't new to camping trips, so we approached everything with a sense of swagger. Our scout leader, Mr. McKinley, often reminded us of safety rules, but we believed we knew it all and could wriggle our way out of any mess. The rainy season had long ended, and dust billowed in clouds beneath our feet, coating our boots. We had spent several days in a small tent camp at the foot of a hill before deciding to trek along the official hiking trail. In the morning, we were up on schedule. We had to reach the new camp before daylight. Everyone stuck together, but after about an hour, many of us began to tire in the unaccustomed heat. Not even the shade of the sequoias provided enough relief. A light breeze occasionally drifted between the trunks, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth, but it quickly vanished, leaving us in a stifling stillness. We walked in silence, occasionally exchanging glances and stopping briefly to snack. Mr. McKinley urged our group on, warning that he wouldn't let us rest until we reached the destination. His sternness was oppressive, yet we tried not to show our discontent. Deep down, I felt that behind all these orders lay something more intriguing. I looked at my friends and realized that we were all waiting for a chance to break the rules. I craved a real adventure, even if it meant deviating from the beaten path. After several hours along the sun-scorched route, I could feel my shirt clinging to my back and the weight of my backpack growing heavier on my shoulders. Time seemed to blur in the sweltering heat. The same massive trunks passed by, interspersed with dry branches and charred stumps that reminded us of past fires. The only one who showed no sign of fatigue was Mr. McKinley. He walked confidently, as if guided by an inner compass, while we trailed behind, doing our best not to fall too far back. It seemed as though he kept repeating the same promise. Only half an hour left to the camp. At those moments, I couldn't help but glance at Ryan, who rolled his eyes as if to say this half hour had already stretched on for 2 days. Everything around us suggested that we were not as close to our goal as we had hoped. Meanwhile, Ben was increasingly struggling to breathe. He had asthma, and I noticed him furtively trying to use his inhaler. His face was constantly slick with sweat, and a soft cough would occasionally break through the heavy silence of the forest. At one point, perhaps tired of our slow pace, Mr. McKinley quickened his steps and swiftly disappeared around a bend in the trail, shouting only that we shouldn't lag behind. I assumed he was going to check the route or scout for a rest spot, but we couldn't afford to delay. there was also the fear of falling behind our leader. Then, in that very moment, Ryan's eyes lit up with a sense of freedom. He motioned for our attention without saying a word, signaling that he wanted us to veer off the main trail and take a detour into a denser, more intriguing part of the forest. The idea sounded reckless, but I was already at my limit. My legs ached. The heat drained my energy, and Ben was literally gasping for air. Nick frowned at the suggestion of straying from the path, but Ryan was fired up about finding a shortcut, or at least a cooler route, to the camp. I too thought that if we could push through the dense underbrush, we might find some shade and catch up with Mr. McKinley at the next bend. We often overestimated our abilities, convinced that we could handle any challenge on our own. The long trail soon disappeared among the mighty sequoias, and on some trees hung warning plaques. Lean, with faded letters that were hard to read. Yet even brief warnings like danger zone and no trespassing were enough for us. I even took mental note of these signs, though for some reason I didn't give them much weight. In my mind, the thought was that if the area was labeled dangerous, it might hide something worthy of a real adventure. We sighed, exchanged glances, and almost simultaneously, all four of us stepped over a length of old rope that seemed to mark the trail's boundary. Ryan was the first to step off, followed by Nick, whose face betrayed his apprehension. Ben lingered behind, glancing back, clearly knowing that being alone in the sweltering forest was even scarier. I let him go ahead, my heart beginning to pound faster. Suddenly, the air grew cooler, as if the sun had slipped behind a cloud for a moment. The shadows between the trees thickened, and the fresh scent of pine was replaced by a musty, swamp-like odor. It felt as though the forest had come alive and grumbled in protest at our intrusion. We walked in silence, trying hard to ignore the oppressive feeling that we were doing something wrong. The long, dark corridors between the trees made me start doubting my initial enthusiasm. Ryan still managed to smile, as if he delighted in the very fact that we were breaking the rules. Nick lagged behind, breathing heavily, while Ben looked at us with a pleading expression, yet he kept moving. Perhaps he hoped that we would soon return to the proper trail. Before long, we found ourselves in a forbidden zone, a place where ordinary tourists never ventured. I wanted to believe it would all end with nothing more than a stern scolding from Mr. McKinley, but a growing sense of dread made itself known, as if an unseen predator were watching our every step. At first, the forest beyond the forbidden area didn't seem especially scary. The sequoias still stood densely together, surrounded by fallen logs and dry needles, and sometimes squirrels rustled in the branches. Occasionally, we would sigh loudly, try to pep ourselves up, and press on. The unique beauty of the ancient trees, their twisted branches, was mesmerizing, as if we were in a landscape from another era. Yet a persistent damp odor of unknown origin refused to let us relax. It was as if something had been rotting beneath the earth for ages. To lighten the mood, we tossed small stones into a nearby creek and exchanged quick glances whenever we noticed something odd. Strange indentations in the moss or claw marks on the bark. We could easily explain these as the work of animals, bears, coyotes, or even mountain lions. Nick tried to keep a rational perspective, reminding us that California teems with wildlife and that these scratches were merely the result of their daily activities. Ryan, however, preferred to imagine something more thrilling. Perhaps Native American spirits or ghostly hunters. I tried to focus on finding a way back onto the trail, a spot where we could rejoin and then bypass Mr. McKinley. In my mind, I already pictured how we'd laugh about our escapade later. But gradually, it became clear that we were venturing deeper into the woods. Ben began to complain of weakness, constantly checking the pocket where his inhaler was kept. I felt a shiver of dread rising in my throat as we passed another clearing with no sign of a well-trodden path. The sun disappeared behind the towering canopies, and the forest descended into a muted twilight. Then Ryan suggested a brief stop to check the map or look at the compass. However, I was the only one with a compass, and as I checked its needle, I noticed it trembling oddly, as if unable to decide on a direction. At that moment, we stumbled upon some old tents. They looked as if they'd been battered by years of rain and wind. The fabric was moldy and in places chewed through. On some panels, long, parallel slashes were visible, as if someone had viciously cut through them with sharp claws or a knife. There were several tents, all tattered and haphazardly strewn across a clearing that had become a trampled mess of mud and wet leaves. Near one, a backpack with a torn zipper lay abandoned. Inside, a crumpled sleeping bag could still be seen, though it too was ripped in several places. Looking at all this, we couldn't fathom what had happened here. I tried to imagine that the camp might have been abandoned from the previous season, if wild animals had indeed attacked. Bears can sometimes tear through fabric and scatter belongings in search of food. But chaos reigned everywhere, and it felt as though people had fled this place in a panic, leaving everything behind. The very atmosphere seemed saturated with fear. The silence was so dense that I could almost hear the beating of my own heart. Nick tried to come up with a logical explanation. He suggested that the rains and the passage of time might have taken their toll, and that large animals could have finished off the remnants. Ryan, however, shook his head at the claw marks. Ben kept his distance, trying not to look at the ruined tents, but the worry on his face was unmistakable. I began to examine the discarded items. In one of the backpacks, I found a worn map of the area, an old pack of nuts, and several faded photographs. The people in the pictures looked happy, but now it all seemed like a grim mockery. There was no trace left of their camping merriment. Bits of fabric, empty cans, and fragments of plastic lay scattered about. Something told me that this had happened not too long ago, perhaps weeks or months earlier, certainly not decades. Suddenly, the mood shifted. The taste of adventure turned abruptly into tension. I sensed that Ben was about to ask us to turn back, a thought I recognized as reasonable. But then Ryan raised his eyebrows, as if urging us to look for something even more intriguing. Anxiety gripped me, and I stood there staring at the deserted campsite. In that moment, it seemed as if those who had fled were not chased by just a wild animal, but by something far more sinister. We decided to stay a little longer to sort out the compass, and that's when an oppressive wave of silence fell over the area. The forest creatures seemed to vanish, and not even the leaves rustled in the wind. The sun was dipping toward the horizon, and staying in such a place was becoming unbearably eerie. Then we discovered that our compass was acting up. The needle spun on its own, and the map I found in an abandoned backpack didn't match the actual landmarks at all. We tried to figure out our direction by the sun, but it was already hidden behind the massive sequoias, and the shadows lengthened so quickly that we lost all confidence. We turned back, trying to recall exactly where we had veered off the trail. The forest around me suddenly seemed even more ominous. The trees stood closer together, and the undergrowth resembled a tangled mass of roots and shrubs. We walked for a long time, only to stumble again upon that same abandoned camp, even though we were sure we were heading in the opposite direction. It was absurd. Apparently, we were walking in circles. Nick and Ryan began to scrutinize the area, looking for any sign of our own tracks, broken twigs, shoe prints, but everything looked distorted, as if the forest itself was erasing our traces. The silence around us grew unnatural. Normally in these woods, you'd hear birds rustling, the buzz of insects. But now, a deathly hush had settled. Not even a slight breeze could be felt. And the leaves hung motionless. That soundless void was deeply unsettling, and a dull panic began to ignite in my chest. It felt as though the forest was holding its breath and watching us. Soon I noticed movement deep among the trees. It was just a blurred smudge, a silhouette. But I caught sight of a couple of eerily flickering dots that looked like eyes. They flashed for a split second, reflecting the faint light. I froze, gripping the trunk of a tree, trying to comprehend what I'd seen. When I blinked, the silhouette was gone, and only the swaying branches reminded me that I hadn't imagined it. I didn't mention it aloud. We were already on edge, and perhaps it was just a trick of the light. Barely had we moved a few steps when Nick spotted a paw print on the ground. It wasn't like a bear's or a wolf's. Far too large, with elongated toes. We didn't exchange a word. That finding seemed to confirm that something was roaming for a creature best avoided at all costs. Ryan tried to maintain his composure, his face showing stubborn defiance, as if he refused to believe in the supernatural until the very end. Ben, on the other hand, stood clutching his backpack to his chest, breathing in short, ragged gasps as he fought off panic. With every passing minute, the darkness deepened, and it felt as if the night was closing in, faster than any ordinary sunset. Our steps slowed, as we feared stumbling over roots or falling into hidden pits. I could hear twigs snapping beneath our feet, and catch fleeting silhouettes between the trees. My mind raced, desperately searching for rational explanations. Perhaps it was just a large dog, a stray coyote, or a wolf. But then, where was their pack? Why was the compass acting so strangely? And why did we keep ending up back at that abandoned camp? We expended a great deal of effort trying to find our way out, but ultimately, we ended up in the same spot again. I was now certain the forest was literally not letting us go. The air became thick with musty, unpleasant smells, as if decaying flesh lay nearby. Ben, almost pleading without words, suggested that we return to the camp where at least the remains of a fire pit could offer shelter for the night. The idea seemed crazy, but we had no other option. Wandering in the dark was too dangerous. I understood that sometimes it's better to hunker down in familiar territory, even if abandoned, than to blindly trudge through endless twilight trails. Just as we gathered again at the edge of a clearing, I thought I heard a low sound emanating from deep in the forest, a noise that wasn't quite a roar or a groan. Ryan froze in place, clenching his fists, and Nick continued to stare at the ground as if searching for a clue. I, however, felt a heavy, malevolent presence creeping up behind me from the darkness. I wanted to run, but I knew it was pointless when you have no idea which way to go. That's when it became clear. We'd walked into a trap. Somewhere nearby, a threat was lurking, capable of silently tracking our every move. And we were nothing more than teenagers, lost in a protected area that all the warning signs, and even Mr. McKinley himself, had cautioned us about. The thickening darkness left us with no choice. Wandering in pitch-black night was tantamount to suicide. We retreated to the abandoned camp, where we found an old fire pit, a shallow depression dug into the ground and circled by stones, its contents reduced to damp ash. It looked as though it hadn't been used for months. We gathered what dry kindling we could in the dim light and tried to get a fire going. Fortunately, my skills were sufficient to coax a weak flame to life, and soon the fire pit flickered with dancing tongues of flame. I could feel the warm glow push back the unsettling dark just a little. yet an icy fear still burned inside me. Images of torn tents, claw marks, that vague silhouette, and the strange paw print flooded my mind. Nick was busy sifting a handful of berries he'd picked earlier when we were still confident in our brilliant idea. I managed only a couple, devoid of any taste as my appetite had completely vanished. Ben fumbled with his inhaler, his breathing growing more erratic, a sound that frightened us more than any beastly roar. Ryan sat closer to the fire, staring into its flickering light as if hoping to find solace there. From our backpacks, we salvaged a few chocolate bars and some water. As we spread everything out by the fire, I recalled stories about people disappearing in national parks. I once thought such tales were nothing more than campfire legends meant to scare tourists away from wandering in the wild. Now, every rustle behind me sent shivers down my spine, and the darkness beyond the fire's glow seemed to watch us with a ravenous curiosity. We sat in anxious silence. Nick occasionally stole quick glances around, trying to spot any moving shadows beyond the trees. Ryan methodically rearranged the remaining wood, tossing new branches into the fire. Ben kept his gaze fixed downward, seemingly trying to stifle his panic. I understood that this oppressive silence was gnawing away at our confidence. The forest was as if dead, and we were the only sources of sound and light in that endless gloom. At one point, I heard a low growl coming from somewhere in the distance. It was muted, almost like a whisper steeped in aggression. A shiver ran down my spine. I looked at the others. Each of them had heard the strange sound too. Nick turned, trying to pinpoint the source, but he saw only a tangle of intertwined trunks. It seemed the creature was hidden behind a dense wall of branches. I harbored no illusions that this was merely a coyote. Every nerve in my body screamed that this was something far more dangerous than any predator I'd known. The fire offered just a little more light than the moon's weak glow, but beyond its circle, everything was swallowed by thick, congealed shadows. I strained to listen, trying to determine if the creature was drawing nearer. The night air seemed to hold its breath. We sat like a powder keg, fully aware that any sound we made might draw the predator straight to us. But there was no alternative. Wandering in the darkness, tripping over roots and succumbing to panic was a far graver risk. With each passing hour, the tension grew. I stared into the glowing embers, remembering home, my parents, and one thought pounded in my mind: we made a mistake. Ryan tried his best to appear calm, but his shoulders trembled with small, involuntary shakes. Nick looked pale, and Ben gritted his teeth so hard that his jaws occasionally creaked. His head bobbed, possibly from exhaustion, panic, and his asthma all at once. He needed a proper rest and a warm tent, not this ghostly, fear-soaked camp. Finally, as midnight neared, we heard a terrible, guttural sound that drowned out the weak crackle of the fire. It came from not too far away, and my heart nearly leapt from my chest. It was as if that beastly note carried with it a ruthless force. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the darkness. It seemed that behind the nearest tree, a pair of blazing eyes was about to appear. Nick grabbed a gnarled stick as if to defend himself. Ryan also stood up, tensing like a coiled spring. Ben let out a soft whimper but quickly clamped his mouth shut, aware that any extra sound might reveal our location all too clearly. That solitary roar came as a sinister harbinger of doom. I felt certain that the forest truly did not want to let us go. I could scarcely imagine that we would all survive until dawn. Yet we stayed huddled together around the fire, clinging to one another as we realized that the worst was yet to come. We sat by the fire deep into the night, straining to listen for every movement beyond the small circle of light. The sense of impending danger was so thick it felt tangible. Soon from the darkness came that all too familiar guttural sound, and my insides went cold. I struggled to maintain my composure, but my heart pounded so fiercely I could barely catch my breath. My nerves were stretched to their breaking point, and when Ben suddenly burst into a loud cry, I knew that was the turning point. At first, he merely sniffled, trying to stifle his terror. But the oppressive silence and the ever-present threat finally shattered his restraint. Ben sprang up, glancing around frantically, his lips trembling. He couldn't hold back any longer and called out for help in a voice choked with despair. That cry rent the night like a jagged tear, and as soon as it died away, I heard a sharp rustling and the crunch of twigs behind the nearest tree. In a split second, something enormous burst out of the darkness, almost right at the edge of our firelight. In that dim glow, I saw a horrifying figure. A bipedal creature with a dog-like or wolfish head, its jaws bared in a savage snarl, eyes burning with an insane fire. Its silhouette was unlike that of a bear or a human. It was too massive, with long limbs ending in terrifying claws. In the blink of an eye, it lunged toward Ben with a speed so frightening I couldn't even register its movement. One moment, Ben was standing a meter from the fire. The next, monstrous claws had him in their grip. I barely had time to react. I only saw a blur of motion and heard a hoarse roar that sent my blood freezing. The creature moved as though it were built for the hunt, silent, swift, and utterly merciless. I realized with dawning horror that Ben was already in its clutches, his scream cut short before I could even fully register it. The impact shattered the air around us, and I instinctively shut my eyes, unable to bear the ghastly scene. For several agonizing moments, my mind was numb, overwhelmed by chaotic thoughts and the relentless clamor around me. Ryan recoiled and seemed about to dash toward Ben, but then, in a panic, he flung himself to the side, terrified of being next. Nick, too, jerked backward, tripping over exposed roots. I felt an unbearable horror tighten within me. The initial impulse to help my friend was quickly overpowered by a primal desire to survive. When I opened my eyes again, the creature had vanished into the darkness along with Ben. A dull, overwhelming pain in my head prevented clear thought. I only knew that his scream had ended too abruptly, and that his chances of survival were now slim. Inside, a helpless fury roiled, mingled with self-revulsion for not having done anything. But there was no time to dwell on it. The same night, filled with that beast, still lay ahead, and it clearly wasn't done after one victim. In a state of panic, Ryan, Nick, and I sprang up, scrambling to organize ourselves. The fire continued to burn, casting ragged shadows on the trees. But its light now seemed like a feeble island amid a boundless void of darkness. The creature that had attacked Ben was unlike any ordinary animal. It moved with far greater speed, purpose, and ferocity than any known predator. The realization paralyzed my mind. In that moment, we all succumbed to a primal instinct: run. Nick grabbed onto a fallen branch and nearly fell while Ryan sprinted ahead, desperate to escape the clearing. I cast one last glance at the dwindling fire, at Ben's overturned backpack, and then chased after them. The pursuit was already at our heels. In my mind, images of those blazing, menacing eyes and teeth capable of tearing a human apart flashed incessantly. We ran blindly through the nocturnal forest, with no idea how to find an exit. The woods no longer seemed like a safe haven. Every trunk appeared to be a lurking predator. I could only hope that Dogman had had his fill of his prey, and wouldn't turn on us immediately. Yet an inexplicable primal feeling told me that the hunt had only just begun. I barreled through the night, not paying attention to the path, leaping over fallen logs and roots. The impact of branches slapping against my face was drowned out by the surge of adrenaline. Behind me, I heard the crackling of snapping twigs. It was hard to tell whether the creature was chasing me or if it was my friends crashing through the underbrush. My head buzzed and my heart pounded so forcefully that I felt as if I might pass out at any moment. Before long, I heard Ryan and Nick calling out to each other somewhere ahead. Without a word or the chance to formulate a plan, we all continued to sprint forward, like a pack of animals fleeing from a forest devourer. I was gripped by flashes of terror as I recalled Ben, his terrified face, the horrifying scream that silenced the beast. I wanted to believe he was still alive, but my mind whispered a harsher truth. I noticed Ryan and Nick had taken off in opposite directions, attempting to bypass the dense thicket. A surge of fear about being left alone seized me, but by sheer force of will I veered after them, hoping that together we might fare a little better. Seconds later, I caught movement out of the corner of my eye. Something darted between the trees again. I slammed to a halt, determined not to run straight into the creature's waiting claws. It turned out to be nothing more than a shifting shadow, but in that darkness, nothing could be trusted. Nick and I nearly collided on a tiny clearing, densely overgrown with brush. Ryan was a short distance away, signaling to us with frantic gestures, though his hands trembled with shock. Yet the darkness was so impenetrable that all our hurried signals dissolved into the black-brown mass of branches and trunks. Only faint patches of moonlight broke through, and in that dimness, every step threatened a fall or a direct encounter with the beast's claws. Then suddenly, heavy footsteps echoed nearby, footfalls that sounded as if something massive and extraordinarily powerful was stomping along the ground. I froze, hearing Nick gasp as if in pain nearby. We both held our breath, watching as a massive four-legged body slipped between the sequoias. Its silhouette towered far above any wolf, its head reaching almost to my waist even when it was on all fours. I saw muscles ripple under the sporadic gleam of moonlight. Those few seconds stretched on like an eternity. Then the creature reared up on its hind legs, a ghastly, wolf-like figure with a stretched spine and absurdly long arms ending in claws capable of rending tents and flesh with ease. I heard its deep guttural breathing, and as its partly open jaws caught the silvery light, a row of razor-sharp fangs was revealed. We stood so close that I could almost smell the musky sweat mixed with decay emanating from it. I don't know how I managed to stay conscious in the face of such horror. Moments later, it suddenly lunged to the left, and for a brief moment I lost sight of it as a thick tree trunk blocked my view. Only a couple of seconds later, I heard a sharp scream, a sound far higher and louder than my own thoughts. It was most likely Ryan. Unable to see what was happening, I could only imagine the creature leaping in several bounds and grabbing him from behind. No scream could compare to that piercing wail which seemed to rip apart the night. Nick made a desperate lunge toward the spot where the attack had likely occurred, but he was immediately halted by a deep gully overgrown with bushes. I couldn't force my body to move. I felt paralyzed. I wanted to scream, but the sound was caught in my throat. I knew then that we had lost another friend, with a dreadful inevitability. A dead silence fell. I stood there, feeling my strength ebbing away, my heart struggling under the strain. Nick was somewhere to the right, huddled behind a fallen tree. Wisps of fog began to gather above the ground, and it seemed as if the entire forest was slowly closing in on us. We both understood. There was no way back. We had no idea which direction forward lay. And in the darkness roamed a creature that could see and hear us far better than we could perceive it. Now it was just the two of us. Ryan was nowhere to be seen, but his harrowing scream still echoed in my ears, sending shivers down my spine at the mere thought. I knew, with stark clarity, that we had reached a point of utter despair. Either we'd find a way out, or the forest would simply swallow us whole. But how could we escape a trap when every path led us right back to the same spot? Staggering, I managed to rise from my knees, fighting to avoid passing out. Nick, his eyes glazed with disbelief, seemed to have lost all hope of rescue. Yet inside me, something suddenly ignited. An instinct for survival. I couldn't just give up. And so we moved forward once more into the unknown, clinging to the slim hope of a miracle even though we had no rational chance. We trudged on, barely discerning the path as our feet sank into the soft, shifting ground. At one point the soil grew wet and almost bog-like, even though we had seen no sign of a swamp before. Nick walked beside me, leaning on a gnarled branch as though it were a cane. I could scarcely keep myself upright. My body felt like an empty shell, haunted only by raw, primal fear. At some point, I noticed that my watch was displaying a meaningless jumble of numbers. The hands spun in circles as if they'd come off their axis, and then froze at some non-existent time. Nick glanced at his wristwatch and frowned. His 2 was erratically stopping and then jerking forward by 2 or 3 hours. We exchanged helpless shrugs, unable to explain the anomaly. I no longer had my compass. I must have dropped it while we were fleeing in panic. In the end, we were left only with an intuitive sense of direction that seemed to deceive us again and again. The forest now stood in a menacing silence, with not a single sound to break the stillness. And that was far more terrifying than any roar or rustle. When everything is quiet, it means the predator could appear at any moment and nothing will warn you of its approach. I couldn't tell how much time had passed. An hour, 2, or the entire night. The darkness remained unyielding, and the moonlight rarely broke through, making me wonder if we were trapped in some horrific limbo. I recalled Mr. McKinley's stories of people who got lost in the woods and were found days later, gaunt and mad, despite believing they had only wandered for a few hours. But we could no longer turn back. There was simply no road home. Then, just as my head began to spin from exhaustion and I nearly collapsed, a faint glimmer appeared ahead. I couldn't believe my eyes. But through the pre-dawn gloom, tents and lanterns materialized. Our scout camp. The very place where we were supposed to rendezvous with Mr. McKinley. A surge of strength returned to me as if by magic. Nick also noticed the lights and, without a word, quickened his pace. We dashed toward them, as if this were our final chance at salvation. When we finally reached the camp, I collapsed to my knees with a groan, a mix of relief and overwhelming pain. At that moment, members of our troop surrounded us. I recognized Mr. McKinley among them. He shouted something. I couldn't make out the words as he inspected our haggard state. Nick fell beside me onto the wet grass, breathing heavily. Everything spun around us. The scout leader embraced me to help me stand, and I felt my body trembling uncontrollably. It seemed as if I had spent years in that sinister forest and had suddenly returned to civilization. Later, several adults gathered around me. Someone even brought a water bottle to my lips. I tried to ask about Ryan and Ben, but the words tangled and burst out as ragged gasps. I felt as though I had recounted an epic tale, yet judging by the worried looks on their faces, my explanation sounded incoherent. Nick, too, could barely form a coherent account of what had happened. My mind buzzed, and I was terrified to close my eyes. For in the darkness, the image of Dogman's fangs and those horrifying eyes would immediately return. Meister McKinley mentioned that we had been missing for only an hour, but that phrase sounded absurd to me. There was no way we'd been lost for less than an hour. I felt my consciousness beginning to slip, likely an emotional and physical breakdown after everything we'd experienced. In the final moments before I lost touch with reality, I saw someone hurrying toward Nick with a first aid kit. Around me, a low murmur of voices filled the air, and I sank into darkness, no longer able to fight it. I woke up in the local hospital ward, judging by the smell of disinfectant and the white walls. My head was heavy and my entire body ached as if I had run a marathon along a mountain trail. As I came to, I noticed unfamiliar people in uniform by the window. They spoke in low voices and occasionally glanced in my direction. It struck me that they might be park rangers or police officers, or perhaps both. Noticing that I'd awakened, one of them approached me and calmly, yet firmly, ordered me not to worry and to rest because I was suffering from shock and trauma. I didn't argue. Chaotic images flashed through my mind, and I couldn't piece them together into a coherent story. Once I managed to think with some clarity, the first questions that flitted through my mind were, where is Ryan? Where is Ben? Are they alive? What happened to them? After that, events blended into a series of brief, painful conversations. In truth, I hardly spoke. I mostly listened. The doctors noted that I had acute nervous exhaustion and signs of depletion that didn't match the short time we'd spent in the forest. I learned that Mr. McKinley had begun searching for us just 30 minutes after we fell behind. When Nick and I were found, not even an hour had passed since our disappearance. I couldn't understand how that was possible. After all, we'd endured an agonizing night in the woods. In response, I received only puzzled looks. As for Ryan and Ben, the official word was that there had been a bear attack, and that they'd likely perished in the wild. That infuriated and horrified me in equal measure. I tried to explain that it wasn't a bear, a cougar, or a coyote. But the people in uniform looked at me sympathetically, insisting that sometimes memory distorts reality after intense stress. They referred to claw marks and evidence resembling a bear's. Yet I remembered clearly Dogman's silhouette, its blazing eyes, and the way it moved. They made it clear that arguing further was pointless. Over time, I began to realize that no one wanted to acknowledge the existence of something supernatural. Apparently, that was the unspoken policy. The park depended on tourism, and any legend of monsters only hurt its reputation and funding. In the end, the official report simply stated, 3 children went missing, and 2 were rescued. They required medical attention, sustained injuries, and suffered severe shock. Neither Ben nor Ryan were among the rescued, and I was given no coherent information about their fate. Mr. McKinley visited me several times. He looked upset, pale. I felt that he knew more than he was letting on, but his eyes betrayed his helplessness in the face of the official explanation. He seemed to want to believe that we'd encountered a tragic, ordinary accident. But I knew that during the night, as the search was underway, he himself might have heard something he wasn't willing or allowed to speak about. Or perhaps he was also under orders to remain silent. In the end, I was discharged from the hospital. I went home to my parents without ever receiving a coherent account or any real answers about the whereabouts of Ben and Ryan's bodies. All that haunted my mind was the terrible thought that they had been killed by Dogman's claws, and that the authorities had done everything possible to cover up something they couldn't handle. Before leaving town, an individual in an unofficial uniform approached me and urged me not to stir up the issue and not to create legends, claiming that such rumors only incite panic. I only gritted my teeth, wishing him a taste of what I had endured. Years later, I still haven't been able to forget the terror I experienced in the redwood forest. I'm now well into my 20s, but the image of tattered tents, motionless moss, and red eyes staring out from the darkness remains vivid. I can't explain the logic of what happened or prove to anyone that Dogman is real. I simply can't. The official version is always so simple. In U.S. parks, thousands of people vanish without a trace or die from accidents, wild animal attacks, or falls into chasms, but I know the truth. Even now, when I remember everything, I am haunted by guilt for the friends I couldn't save. Ryan and Ben were lost that night, becoming nameless victims of an anomalous creature. Nick hasn't spoken to me since. Perhaps he has his own truth and pain he doesn't wish to discuss. I don't blame him. I understand how hard it is for both of us to process that nightmare. Today I've decided to tell this story, knowing that many will just dismiss it as a scary tale. But if you ever venture into a national park, especially into its remote, little explored areas, please don't stray from the trail. If you see a sign marked Danger Zone, believe that it isn't there for nothing. The forest holds many secrets, and sometimes it's better not to know which predators truly lurk behind those thick trunks. And when you hear legends about cryptids, be they Bigfoot, Dogman, or other creatures, don't be too quick to dismiss them. The world is full of anomalies that defy conventional science. Sometimes just one step beyond the forbidden boundary can turn everything into a tragedy. I know this from my own experience, and the bitter lesson continues to haunt me to this day.